In May 2013, we planned to take the boat from the Orwell round to Brixham, where Matthew's wife would join us by car. We would then spend half-term cruising the West Country, before returning via the Channel Islands and the French coast. The weather was good when we set off on May the 19th, although rather cold. The quays at Felixstowe were relatively empty, which we took to be a sign of the ongoing economic situation. Crossing the entrance to the Stour, we had to slow a little while the Stellarland ferry made her departure. Leaving the harbour, we headed across Devcourt Bay, heading for the Naze. The area off the Naze is a minefield of poorly marked potboys. We headed across the top of the Gunflint Sands before heading down East Swin to cross the Sunk Sands opposite Barrow Number 2. Entering Black Deep, we had to bear away behind a freighter before crossing the channel to Fisherman's Gap. By the time we reached North Foreland, the tide was beginning to turn against us, and we pulled into Ramsgate. The next day was dank and dismal, so we settled for a short hop to Dover. Can you see it? There's in the cloud.
Yeah, it's hidden in the cloud.
The 21st was a little better, with just enough wind to make reasonable progress. The tide was only just turning against us at Beachy Head, so we carried on past Eastbourne and on to Brighton. 22nd was again a reasonable day, so we took the Loo Channel inside the hours and on into the Solent where we moored up at Cowes. It was a bumpy, noisy night moored up in Cowes, and as the forecast was for even more wind on the 23rd, we headed across the Solent to Lymington to seek more shelter. As we were heading up the river, a 40-knot squall came through which covered the deck in hailstones. We rigged the sun awning as a cockpit tent, which at least gave us somewhere to keep wet clothing. We then had to consider our options. The next 3 days were forecast to be good, but after that it looked as though we were due for a week of gales and rain. We didn't really fancy being stormbound in Brixham, so we decided to carry on to Poole, then come back into the Solent and hide in Portsmouth for a week. When we got out into the Solent, we found some sort of race going on. The tide hadn't quite started ebbing yet, so to get through the Hurst Narrows we threw the cruising chute up and try and get pace with the rest of them. And some people say Class B AAS doesn't cause screen clutter. We anchored in Studland Bay for the night and took the dinghy ashore to meet my daughter at the local pub for a meal. On the 26th, we sailed slowly back towards the Solent. It began to look as though we might not make it through the Narrows before the tide turned, so reluctantly we started the engine again. Once safely inside, we rigged the cruising chute as a spinnaker and ran down the length of the Solent. Once in Portsmouth, we booked into Haslar Marina for the week. On the 27th, from inside the marina it looked pleasant in the Solent, but it was blowing a good 25 knots and we had a bumper passage across to Osborne Bay. Whilst anchoring, the throttle linkage to the quadrant failed and we spent the next hour crawling in the lazarette to fix it. All of this made Maureen, who had driven down to join us, feel rather queasy, so we sailed back under just the jib. Once there, we put the tent up and turned the heating on and became campers for the next week. We had hoped to get into the new Mary Rose exhibition, but although we saw the opening ceremony, we weren't important enough to be allowed in on the first day, so we had to make do with the rest of the dockyard. The forecast of the 31st looked okay, although the winds were still going to be northerly and cold, so we decided to stick to the English shore for our return passage. As we left the harbour, HMS Edinburgh was outside, waiting to be escorted in for her decommissioning. HMS Daring was coming out to escort her in, and unusually she was displaying her AIS, but someone doesn't seem to have got the hang of it in the RN. According to this, she was still firmly moored up. The passage inside the hours and round to Eastbourne was quiet, and a mixture of motoring and motor sailing. We left the lock at Eastbourne early, but there was still a lot of west-going tide to go. Most sensible people were heading west. We headed east. We were making reasonable progress and just hoped that the tide would turn before we got to Dungeness. It was only when we were alongside that I recognised so-called Hastings Harbour from an episode of Foyle's War. The tide hadn't quite changed as we approached Dungeness, so we resorted to motoring again to get ourselves past. Soon after we got past, the tide turned and we motor-sailed on past Dover to Ramsgate. Leaving Ramsgate on the 2nd of June, we came across these two girls rowing past South Foreland. They were going against the tide and must have been making heavy weather of it. From North Foreland we sailed hard on the wind, but could only lay Kentish Knock. With the wind fading, we motored through Fisherman's Gap. We took our usual short cut across the Sunk Sands, onto Gunfleet Sands and back home.